Hey everyone, so today we're going to take a look at the first 6 chapters of Victor Frankenstein's portion of the story. But before we do that, make sure that you review your notes, take more notes, and seriously start thinking about your research project if you haven't done so already. You should have at least a topic in mind by the time you get to the end of your next reading section. So chapter 1 of Victor's story is primarily spent relating the history of his immediate family in Geneva, Switzerland. Namely, we're treated to the story of how his father, Alphonse, met and married his mother, Caroline. This discussion of family lineage is often a tool that writers use as a way of providing context for their protagonist, but sometimes it's really just to fill up space. Shelley, however, is using this to in fact emphasize one of the themes she introduced with Walton's letters, that of the importance of love and companionship. Victor's parents were almost cliché in their love for each other, and that love and affection carried over to Victor, their eldest child, who was, to quote, their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me. Right away, we also see that Shelley is focusing on the importance of loving and involved parents towards the raising of a happy and healthy child, something that even now we as readers can assume will play a big role once Victor creates his own child. The fact that Victor's happiness in his childhood is directly tied in with the love of his parents and, though obviously debatable, this seems to be one of the messages that Shelley is going for. We're also introduced to Victor's adopted sister / cousin / future love interest, Elizabeth. Now, ignoring the very problematic issues of classism in her adoption and borderline racism in her description, it's interesting to take note of what Shelley does with one of the few female characters in the novel. Remember, Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, is considered by many to be one of the spiritual founders of modern feminism, so it's interesting to see how Elizabeth is described as this blonde-haired, blue-eyed little angel found in filthy squalor, and how she is so pure and immediately loved by everyone. It's almost like Shelley is creating this stereotypical Virgin Mary style of character. Because she falls so clearly into this cliché, we now have to consider that perhaps Elizabeth is being steered towards a more symbolic role. This purity and innocence must mean something thematically, and the fact that young Victor is so smitten must also act as some sort of thematic foreshadowing. The fact that we already know where Victor ends up, alone in the Arctic, as well as our own experience with the story and other literature, we can probably make a pretty good guess as to what happens to Elizabeth later on, and what that might mean. Chapter 2 further elaborates on Victor's childhood, which he describes as being the happiest that anyone could ever ask for. As alluded to earlier, this is in a large part due to his loving parents, a new baby brother named Ernest, his whatever with Elizabeth, and his friendship with Henry Clerval, his best friend. Clerval is described by Shelley as a foil to Victor early on, his love of literature and art being, quote, deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs and began to write many a tale of enchantment and knightly adventure. This love of the arts is in direct contrast to Victor's love of science. He describes himself as having a violent temper and a desire for knowledge. As Victor says, it was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. My inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. Add that in with the next description of Elizabeth, who shone like a shrine-dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. She was a living spirit of love, and we see how Shelley has created her own trinity of characters, an early 19th century Harry, Ron, and Hermione, if you will. Thematically, this is important to pay attention to. From one perspective, we can see how each of these 3 characters is perhaps meant to represent the different elements of humanity. Victor as the intellect, Clerval as the heart, and Elizabeth as the soul. All 3, it would seem, are needed to create a healthy, balanced human being, but Shelley also shows how it does not seem possible for all to exist in a single person. They need others to balance them out, as Shelley points out in her description of how Clerval evens out Victor and Elizabeth evens out Clerval. Shelley is setting it up so that it seems like the removal of any from this trinity will lead to disaster, and again, based on where we know Victor ends up, she may be right. We also learn of Victor's early education, and it directly mirrors Walton's. They were both self-educated through the books in their guardians' homes, and their discoveries shaped their future paths accordingly. Victor reads a book by a man named Cornelius Agrippa, a real-life alchemist and occultist who spoke of magic and natural sciences, which fascinated young Victor. His father said that it was garbage, but as Victor states, never explained why, and if he had done so, perhaps Victor's life would have turned out differently. However, like all kids who are told no, he continued to study anyway, again showcasing the importance of parental influence. Like Walton, Victor recognizes how being self-educated in this fashion has led to absences in his life. For Walton, it was a lack of friends and companionship, and for Victor, it was a lack of boundaries and control over his intellectual pursuits. Through this, Shelley is showing the importance of education, but also the importance of the right kind of education. Knowledge is power, but some power is better off ignored if it will lead to disaster. Again, this is debatable, the idea that knowledge and information should be censored in some regards, but if you think about it, the argument could be made that for all the benefits of the internet in our modern world, there are some dark and terrible aspects of it that should be kept from certain people. It's an interesting dilemma. The next event in Victor's life to steer his future course was his witnessing of a destructive lightning storm at 15. He learns of galvanism, or the idea that all living things are connected and created by some form of electricity. Take that as you will. Witnessing this power of the natural world steers Victor from his old intellectual pursuits towards mathematics and science, which he admits seemed almost divine intervention. However, it is important to remember that Victor is telling this story through flashback, and we're reminded of this when he describes how, when I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. However, destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. This moment of reflection reminds Walton and us, the reader, that this is a cautionary tale. Through Victor, Shelley is showing us the dangers of his past and future actions, and as a narrative technique, this cliffhanger ending reemphasizes the horror of the events to come, and keeps us waiting for more. Much like in a Shakespearean tragedy, even though we already know how it ends, we stick around to see how and why it happens, which of course is the entire thematic point. Chapter 3 begins in tragedy, with the loss of Victor's mother to scarlet fever, contracted while she cared for Elizabeth's own sickness. This event adds further support for the thematic purpose of the women in the story, at least so far, the idea that they are pure and good, foregoing their own well-being for their loved ones. Now this is pretty problematic, especially for modern readers. It pushes women into a stereotype, without adding any complexity to who they are as individuals. So for us, it seems like Shelley is doing them a disservice, regulating Elizabeth and Caroline to supporting roles for the benefit of the male characters. However, and remember, this is open for a lot of debate, you can argue that Shelley is purposeful in this beyond just the context of her time. Women act as a balance for men. So far, it seems as if both Victor and his father run the risk of obsessing over their respective fields without the influence of Elizabeth and Caroline, respectively, which it also seems leads to unhappiness. If we take a look at nature, we also see the necessity of both genders. Obviously, we need both to survive, contrary to what centuries of misogyny and sexism has tried to force down our throats, and it can be argued that both father and mother are needed in the raising of children. Again, please remember that there are many sides to this, and this is just a potential reading, but keep it in mind anyways as to form your own opinions. Back to the novel. His mother's death has a profound effect on Victor, one that he takes with him to university in Ingolstadt, and one, it is important to note, that he takes alone. Neither Clerval nor Elizabeth can accompany him, so he is now isolated from the important influence that he discussed earlier, and when this happens, we all reach out for some new form of support and guidance. Victor finds this in the form of two professors, Krempe and Waldman, both of whom offer very different influences upon the young Frankenstein. Krempe is a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favor of his pursuits, who scolds Victor for his earlier readings of Agrippa and the like, and essentially tells him that he's going to need to completely restart his education. This description provides some insight into one of Victor's many flaws, and that is the fact that he is superficial. Krempe is not particularly attractive to look at, so therefore he's not going to pay much attention to any of his advice. We saw this earlier with his description of Elizabeth compared to her siblings, but now we really see how this will be a problem. Victor's belief that physical beauty is reflective of inner beauty is sorely misguided, and will come back to hurt him later on. Waldman, however, is quite the opposite of Krempe. His person was short but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. In other words, he's handsome, so therefore Victor likes him and will listen, honestly, as he never heard of Beauty and the Beast. Waldman also says what Victor wants to hear, namely that Victor's old influences were actually good ones, and the idea that through combining them with modern science, one may accomplish wonders beyond imagining. Victor takes this to heart, declaring how so much has been done. More, far more will I achieve. Treading the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. Sound familiar? If you said Walton, then you are correct. This is the poisoned chalice that Victor is warning him about, the divine drive for success and glory, simply for one's own sake. The chapter ends with Victor apprenticing himself, in a way, to Waldman, and learning how to use his machines in laboratory. However, Shelley leaves us on an ominous note, both echoing and counteracting Victor's observation from the end of chapter 2. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. The beginning of chapter 4 details Victor's obsessive dive into his studies of the natural philosophy, and how he isolates himself from everyone for the next 2 years, including his family and friends back home. Proving Shelley's point about how this isolation is perhaps becoming self-destructive, we see Victor eventually turns towards the study of anatomy and biology, until eventually he discovers what he calls the cause of generation and life. Nay, more I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Now, Shelley was no scientist, and there is clearly no known answer to this riddle of life as of yet, so she sidesteps the actual explanation of Victor's secret by having him address Walton, and through Walton us, and say that he's simply not going to tell.
Alright then, keep your secrets.
That said, the aside to Walton / the reader again reiterates that this is a cautionary tale on the dangers of toying with matters beyond our understanding. As Victor says, learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than nature will allow. This could essentially be Shelley's theme statement for this particular message. In modern terms, you could sum it up as stay in your educational and intellectual lane. Again, very debatable, but all the best themes are. Now that he has the knowledge, Victor's next conflict can best be summed up by Dr. Ian Malcolm from that other science fiction novel on the dangers of unchecked pursuit of accomplishment, Jurassic Park, so you can kinda see how humanity still struggles with these questions.
I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
Anyway, Victor begins to plan how he's going to use this new knowledge, and he decides on what is, of course, the most logical course of action. In order to make it easier to work with all the small things like veins and stuff like that, he'll create a gigantic human being. Genius, am I right? However, we must also look at how Victor's true goals are again a reflection of Walton's. This isn't just for science, but for glory and his own arrogance. As he states, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. The sheer hubris or excessive pride of this statement is the key to Victor's future downfall, and we see more of Shelley's theme of parental obligation and duty. Instead of looking at it as the creator having responsibility for the child, he's treating it as though the child owes him. And then begins the images that we are familiar with when it comes to the story of Frankenstein. The grave robbing, the sewing of flesh, the mad scientist in his lab. Victor is now truly obsessed and neglects all correspondence with his family, ignoring all letters from home. Again, though, the Victor we see now is not the Victor telling the story. He's able to look back and reflect upon his mistakes, which he does when he states that, if the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures, then that study is certainly unlawful, not befitting the human mind. This is a man who has lost everything to his arrogance and obsession, and he knows it, musing on how if humanity's reach had not exceeded its grasp, we may all be the happier for it, as Shelley makes allusions to the violent colonization of North America to prove her point. And then because Shelley knows her audience, she comes back and has Victor say that he's boring us and gets on to the most exciting part of the story. And the chapter ends with Victor describing how his work has destroyed him physically, as he is both literally and metaphorically feverish, but it doesn't matter. His work was all that mattered, and it was almost complete.
The end.
Dun, dun, dun.
The moment we've all been waiting for, the creation of the creature.
Look, it's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
And it's over in half a page. Victor succeeds in his goal. He has created life. However, the regret is instantaneous as he looks upon his creation and recoils in horror at what he sees. As he worked, he believed that he had crafted the most beautiful creature in all of existence, but the reality is quite the opposite. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. And then, like all good parents, he ran screaming out of the room. In all seriousness, though, this reflects Victor's earlier judgments of his professors. He is so focused on the superficiality of appearance that he neglects to acknowledge anything beyond the ugliness of what he sees. Victor collapses into nightmares from exhaustion and illness, but awakens to see that the creature has followed him, and the description Shelley provides is, depending on your point of view, both horrifying and achingly pathetic. Horrifying for Victor, but sad for us. Now I want you to imagine you're a newborn infant brought into the world without any say in the matter, confused and scared and having no idea what's going on. The first sight you see, though you don't know this, is your parent, the one who is supposed to love and protect you, and this person runs from you in terror and abandons you. Imagine the effect that would have on you. When the creature reaches out to Victor, grinning and making inarticulate sounds, all he sees is a monster trying to attack him. For the reader, however, Shelley asks us to perhaps look at it from this second point of view, that of an infant smiling and reaching for a father that wants nothing to do with it. As I said, achingly sad and pathetic. This first interaction with humanity will have a profound effect on the creature, but that story will be told later on. Upon his second escape and his night spent sleeping in the church, Victor makes another reference to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and upon a superficial reading, we see how it reflects Victor's fear, but for those who know the poem and understand its story, it ties back into the theme of striking out against nature and the consequences that follow. We are reintroduced to Clerval, who finds Victor and nurses him back to health, but we are also shown hypocritical irony in Victor's actions. When he and Clerval return to his lab, Victor reveals that while he was afraid of seeing the creature again, he was more afraid of letting Clerval see what he had done. For a man who desired to be known and worshipped for his accomplishments, we see the true nature of his actions. They were for him and him alone, and he has no desire for anyone to ever know of his failure. Another thematic lesson from Shelley: if you can't be proud of what you've done, then you shouldn't have done it. Chapter 6 begins with an extended letter from Elizabeth, which Shelley uses to place some more pieces on the board for later, namely that of Justine Moritz and young William, Victor's youngest brother. Oh, Ernest is mentioned to be considering the military, but who cares? Justine is the live-in servant of the Frankensteins, and Elizabeth spends a good deal of time describing how she came to be in their care, in a way very similar to her own, but not quite so romantic. And then there's a little curly-haired, blue-eyed William who everybody just loves and adores, and is just too perfect for words. If you've ever seen a picture of those little naked baby angels, that's pretty much what he looks like. I wonder why Shelley would make a point of describing him this way so randomly. After a long while, Victor and Clerval decide to head back home to Geneva. The rest of the chapter reiterates the juxtaposition between Victor and Clerval that Shelley had set up in Chapter 2, namely how Clerval is a man of the arts compared to Victor's life of science, and how sorely Victor needs that balance. Indeed, he comments on the relief he feels hearing of Clerval's thoughts and opinions on knowledge so different from Victor's own. He remembers how Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend, how sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. Shelley is again reminding us of the balance that is needed in our education, but also the fundamental importance of human love and connection in the creation of a healthy, happy individual. Victor had forgotten this, and is now only rediscovering that joy, the same joy that he has kept from his creature. And despite how much he is trying to forget and ignore what he has done, Victor will soon learn that success and creation always comes with a cost.